phenomenon of the original TV Superman, and the actor who brought the character to life. George Reeves, killed one night by a speeding bullet. Police called it a suicide, but was it?
Why were there no fingerprints on the gun?
What happened that night? And some reflections from Superman's original sidekicks, Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen. Bill Ritter with the life and death of a television legend. Who killed Superman? Original Superman, George Reeves. He left behind more than a television legacy. He also left behind an intriguing Hollywood mystery. Who killed Superman? When 2020 Downtown continues after this from our ABC.
You're looking at a place called Superman Square in the Illinois town of, where else? Metropolis. Here, just like on the screen, Superman looms larger than life. You know, for people of a certain age, and I include myself in that group, mention Superman and you immediately think of George Reeves, TV's first Superman. He could change the course of mighty rivers, bend steel in his bare hands. Superman was indestructible, or so it seemed. In June 1959, George Reeves was found dead. Police called it a suicide. Case closed. But many people never believed that. For them, his death remains an unsolved Hollywood mystery. Tonight, we reopen the case. Look, up in the sky, it's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's Superman.
As a kid, it was hard for me to imagine anybody cooler than Superman. For millions of us, he was our first superhero, and only we were in on the big secret. The guy behind the Foster Grants was indeed the Man of Steel. In the years to follow, there would be other Supermen, but if you grew up when I did, George Reeves was the man.
George Reeves holds a special place in the hearts of millions of baby boomers. And there was something particularly likable about him, almost fatherly, if you will.
When it comes to buying savings stamps, Jimmy, I'm afraid everything's bound to come out all right.
The Adventures of Superman was one of TV's earliest filmed series. But believe it or not, at first the producers couldn't find a sponsor. So the series sat on the shelf. Nobody saw it for 2 years. When the show finally made it to TV in February 1953, it was an instant smash, especially with the kids. George Reeves and the other actors suddenly became huge stars. Jack Larson played Jimmy Olsen.
After a couple of weeks, I couldn't take the subway anymore. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't eat where I ate. There would be mobs around restaurants. I'd try to have a breakfast at a place called the Yankee Doodle on Madison Avenues, and the police had to get me out.
Kids everywhere were trying to be like Superman. Unfortunately, some kids took the game too far.
We all warned kids not to fly, and George did, because kids were jumping out of windows, and they'd put a towel on themselves and try to fly. And so he did a thing saying only Superman can fly.
Inspector Henderson, Lois Lane.
And then there was Lois Lane. Beautiful, independent, feisty, with a nose for news and for trouble. For lots of us baby boomers, she was our first crush.
My favorite episode was probably the one where I was going to marry Superman.
Noel Neill played Lois Lane in 78 episodes. She figured she was rescued by Superman 80 times.
Another few seconds and it would have been too late, Superman.
But it wasn't, Miss Lane, and that's what counts. What time is it?
Yes, that was sort of the theme of all of our shows. He would just come in and we'd say, gosh, Superman, it's good to see you, or just in time.
Still, Superman was a role George did not relish. He fancied himself a serious actor. Here he is in Gone with the Wind. But now, George found himself trapped in the Superman role, branded with a big red S. To make matters worse, he never really made a super salary. At his peak, he was paid just $2,500 a week, and he worked only 13 weeks a year.
We should have made big money. We were fools. They couldn't have done the show without us. He never earned a lot of money, and George lived big.
Make that George lived very big, in fact, well beyond his means. But he had help from a powerful Hollywood matron named Toni Mannix.
Toni was in love with George. They'd been together for some years.
Toni was a former showgirl, a star of the Ziegfeld Follies. She was 8 years older than George, and it was her money that bought George the good life. She gave him a car, covered his monthly liquor bills, even paid for his secluded canyon home. But what made their love affair so bizarre was that Tony was married to one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, MGM Studio Vice President Eddie Mannix.
Let me see if I understand this. He's sleeping with Eddie Mannix's wife.
Right.
For years?
About 10 years. It was a long-going, well-known, open secret in Hollywood.
Well known in Hollywood, maybe, but not in the homes of millions of Superman fans. Nancy Schoenberger co-wrote a book about George Reeves called Hollywood Kryptonite.
So nobody knew that the real-life Superman, George Reeves, was having...
An affair with a married woman. No, George really had, in a sense, a double life, just like Clark Kent.
By 1958, the Superman series was out of production, and no casting director in the country would touch George Reeves. In frustration, perhaps, he wrote to the Screen Actors Guild and resigned, gave up on acting. George also gave up on Tony, dumped her for a woman 20 years younger, a New York party girl named Lenore Lemon. She could match George's appetite for alcohol martini for martini. It wasn't long before they were engaged. Tony was devastated.
Did she talk about Lenore?
She hated Lenore, and she referred to her in language I wouldn't even begin to say.
What did she call her?
Think of all the pejorative, X-rated terms you can for a female.
Called her a whore?
Absolutely.
Called her a slut?
Absolutely. Keep
Called
going.
her a bewitched?
Absolutely. Everything. And more. She was incensed. She hated her.
That this woman, two decades younger than she...
Right. Stole her...
Stole Superman.
Her Superman away from her.
George had turned his life around. He had shed his Superman cape, shed Tony, and was pursuing a new career as a director. But on the morning of June 16, 1959, L.A. cops said he took his own life, a single bullet to the head.
I remember that day. I was crushed. Millions of other kids were too. How could Superman die? And why would George Reeves take his own life?
When we come back, the final episode in George Reeves' life. What really happened that last night, and suspicions about a woman's scorn.
It's the oldest motive in the book. Revenge, heartbreak, fury.
2020 Downtown, the newest member of the 2020 family, now in its 21st year. Winner of a... Continues, once again, Bill Ritter.
Superman George Reeves was dead. Millions of baby boomer kids like me were dumbfounded. And to this day, many still wonder, will we ever know what really happened?
Police found George naked and on his bed, a gunshot wound through his temple, and a single bullet in the ceiling. George's new Luger was at his feet. It was quickly ruled a suicide, but not all the evidence added up.
There were no fingerprints found on the gun, which is quite curious in a suicide case. Why were there no fingerprints on the gun?
At least 4 others were in the house, including George's fiancée, Lenore Lemon. All were drinking heavily. Lenore told police George was depressed because he couldn't get work. But Superman expert Chuck Harder disagreed. We caught up with him in the crypt that holds George's mortal remains.
On the day he died, he got word the Superman show was back on. He was going to direct. He had a lot of money coming in. And on the whole, his professional life on that last day really took an upswing.
Incredibly, police never again interviewed the house guests, despite new evidence that later emerged, like 2 more bullet holes found in George's bedroom floor, and these coroner's pictures, never before seen in public. George appears battered, a bruise on his forehead, a wound on his elbow. Did George fight for his life? Author Nancy Schoenberger says he was murdered.
Once you rule out suicide, the only person who had a motive was Tony Mannix.
You remember Tony, the wealthy, jilted lover who paid for George's house and later watched a younger woman move in.
Why would Tony Mannix want George Reeves dead?
It's the oldest motive in the book. Revenge, heartbreak, fury.
Tony was so furious, she hired someone to harass George with phone calls, dozens a day. But Schoenberger says it didn't stop there. She believes Tony hired a hitman who shot George with his own gun, then slipped out a window without being seen by anyone in the house. Merrill Sparks was one of the last people to see George alive. He was playing piano that night in a Beverly Hills restaurant when he saw George and Lenore walk in. Lenore seemed to be working the bar.
You know, she was flirting.
She was saying hello. She was saying hello to people. They had some kind of little disagreement or something. I remember they're talking about Tijuana and Baja California.
Tijuana and Baja. That's where George and Lenore were planning to honeymoon. Now they were arguing about it. Was George getting cold feet?
Was she yelling at him?
Almost, yes, almost yelling.
In his face?
Mm-hmm.
Was she animated? What was going on?
She was animated.
Less than 2 hours later, George was dead. The LAPD never interviewed Merrill Sparks. They also never talked to Jan Bliss, one of George's neighbors, who also heard them argue that night. She's now 91. Her husband was at the house drinking with the other guests. When she went to fetch him, Jan says she looked in the front window.
George and Lenore, as far as I know, were having a heavy fight. Yeah, definitely an argument, and I guess that George got disgusted and went on upstairs.
She then heard a single shot.
I heard one shot only.
But what about the 2 extra bullet holes? And what about these pictures? We showed them, along with the coroner's report, to several forensic pathologists, including former Ventura County medical examiner Dr. Warren Lovell. All the experts agreed.
It adds up to a classic suicide finding. In other words, a right-handed man, a contact wound. The muzzle was right against the skin when this shot was fired, and the right temple went slightly backwards and I think very slightly upwards. I think this fits being a classic suicide.
Lovell says it would be nearly impossible for an intentional homicide or even an accident to mimic this shot. As for the head bruise, that could have been caused by the bullet, which cracked George's skull like an eggshell. The elbow injury was an old abrasion that was healing, he says, and the minor bruises on George's chest may be tied to his blood alcohol level, a staggering 0.27. George was fall-down drunk when he died.
There's no evidence of struggle that's clear-cut at all to me.
So, the forensic experts we talked to believe George Reeves did indeed shoot himself. But there are still unanswered questions, like the mystery of the 2 extra bullet holes. Lenore later admitted that days before George died, she accidentally fired one of those rounds while fiddling with the gun. She stuck to that story in this rare 1989 interview. But she never explained the other bullet hole, and never explained why, if she did fire the gun, her prints weren't on it. Did she wipe them off? Is that why there were no fingerprints? She took those secrets to her grave. Lots of Superman fans would like to reopen this case, but that will never happen. Tony and Lenore are both dead. As for George, only his ashes remain. Whatever happened that night in June 1959, people of a certain age will always remember George Reeves as the big-hearted hero of our youth, the best Superman there ever was.
His co-stars say George Reeves never made a public appearance dressed as Superman. Ironically, he was too afraid a young fan would shoot at him, thinking Superman was invincible. We'll be right back.
Okay, settle. Okay, now let's find out a little more about Craig and Ariana.
Okay, yeah, my name is Ariana, and, I'm just like Mary Tyler Moore, except I don't have a Jewish friend. Okay. I'm coming to terms with my small chest, and, despite my bike